A day in Greenwood Park. Greenwood Park was a vibrant place, especially on weekends. The park, located at the heart of the city, was a sanctuary where families from all walks of life gathered to unwind and enjoy a peaceful respite from their busy lives. Children's laughter would bounce off the trees, mingling with the occasional barks of dogs as they raced through the grass, hitting balls or each other. It was the kind of scene that could make anyone momentarily forget the pressures of the world outside. Today, the sun was warm but not overpowering, casting a golden glow over the park. A soft breeze rustled through the leaves of the oak and maple trees, adding to the sense of tranquility. Food vendors dotted the edges of the park, their stalls wafting mouth-watering aromas that made passersby slow down, even if just to take in the scent of sizzling burgers, sweet crepes, or freshly popped popcorn. In the center of this lively atmosphere was Mark, a black man in his late 30s. His gentle demeanor and easy smile made him an approachable figure in the neighborhood. Mark worked as a graphic designer and had a laid-back personality, but he was fiercely protective of his family, especially his daughter, Lily. Today, Mark had set aside all work to spend a much-needed day at the park with Lily, his adopted daughter. Lily was a whirlwind of energy. At 6 years old, she had a boundless enthusiasm for life. Her wild blonde curls bounced with every step she took as she darted around the playground, full of laughter and delight. She was as curious as she was mischievous, often testing her father's patience, but always bringing a smile to his face. It was clear to anyone watching that their bond was special. Despite the difference in their appearances, their connection was undeniable. Mark watched with a father's mixture of joy and vigilance as Lily sped across the playground, zigzagging between the equipment, her laughter echoing in the air. She would call out for him to chase her, and he, always playing along, pretended to be much slower than he was, letting her win their game of tag over and over again. Occasionally, she would stop and giggle, daring him to try and catch her, her blue eyes sparkling with glee. Mark loved these moments, and not just for the fun, but for what they represented, his undying love for this little girl who had become the center of his world. From a nearby bench, a woman in her early 50s sat quietly sipping her iced tea. She was a familiar face in the community, often involved in local events and neighborhood watch programs. Known for her involvement, Cho was the kind of person who liked to feel that she was doing her part to keep the community safe and orderly. She had lived in the neighborhood for over 2 decades, and she took pride in her role as a self-proclaimed community guardian. However, Cho's sense of duty sometimes went overboard, driven by her own prejudices and unexamined biases. As she observed Mark and Lily from a distance, Cho's eyes narrowed. It wasn't the playful scene that concerned her, but the stark contrast between the father and daughter. To her, something didn't sit right about their appearance together. A black man with a white child? It wasn't the kind of pairing she was used to seeing, and in her mind, it didn't align with her expectations of what a normal family should look like. As Mark continued to chase Lily around the playground, Cho couldn't shake her feelings of discomfort. She didn't know Mark personally, and she wasn't aware of Lily's adoption story. All she saw was a man who didn't seem to fit with the little girl he was playing with, and that observation alone was enough to plant seeds of suspicion in her mind. Though she would never admit it aloud, her reaction was deeply rooted in her own unspoken prejudices, biases that had never been challenged because, in her view, she was simply doing what was right, looking out for the safety of others. It wasn't long before her feelings of unease turned into something more insidious. Lily, still caught up in the excitement of their game, darted ahead of her father, her eyes bright with joy. She was looking back at Mark, teasing him as he pretended to struggle to keep up with her. In her excitement, she didn't notice the large root from an old oak tree sticking up slightly from the ground. Her foot caught on the root, and she went tumbling down with a surprised yelp. Mark's reaction was immediate. He rushed to her side, his face filled with concern, and scooped her up into his arms. Lily's fall hadn't been serious, but her cry of surprise and pain was enough to bring an abrupt end to their laughter. Mark knelt down, checking her for any signs of injury, his voice soft and soothing as he brushed dirt from her scraped knees. "It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy's here." "You're all right," he whispered, gently wiping away a stray tear that had formed in her eye. Lily sniffled but soon buried her face in his chest, comforted by his presence. She was more startled than hurt, and within moments her tears were drying up thanks to her father's calming reassurances. However, from her bench, Cho's perspective of the scene was entirely different. She had been watching closely, and when she saw Lily fall and Mark rush to pick her up, her heart began to race for all the wrong reasons. To Cho, the sight of the black man cradling the crying white child triggered something primal, a misguided sense of danger. Despite seeing the love and concern in Mark's actions, Cho's mind twisted the scene into something sinister. What if he wasn't her father? What if something terrible was happening? Cho's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She had seen enough, or so she believed. Her mind, filled with societal conditioning and deep-seated fears she never fully acknowledged, convinced her that she was witnessing something more than just a father comforting his daughter. She was witnessing what she believed could be an abduction or worse. Am I really seeing what I think I'm seeing? She muttered to herself. Her hand gripped her phone tighter, her sense of duty overpowering any rational thought. To her, it was better to be safe than sorry, even if that meant jumping to conclusions without fully understanding what was unfolding before her. Chove hesitated for only a moment before dialing the number. Her voice quivered as she spoke to the dispatcher. "There's a man here in the park with a little girl. I think she might be in danger," Cho said, her eyes still locked on Mark and Lily. As she described the scene to the dispatcher, her language was unintentionally laced with the bias she carried, painting Mark as a suspicious figure, rather than a loving father. As she hung up, a wave of anxiety washed over her. For the first time, Cho began to question her actions. Had she done the right thing? Or had she just set into motion something terrible based on her own unfounded fears? Her heart raced as she watched the scene unfold, the normal hum of the park slowly interrupted by the distant wail of sirens. The weight of assumptions. As the sirens drew nearer, the once vibrant and carefree atmosphere of Greenwood Park started to shift. The laughter of children, the cheerful barking of dogs, and the light-hearted chatter of families all began to fade into the background, replaced by a growing sense of tension. Mark, still kneeling beside Lily, noticed the subtle change in the air. He glanced up, his brow furrowed in confusion as he heard the sirens approaching. Lily, sensing the sudden seriousness in her father's demeanor, held on to him a little tighter. Her small hand grasped his shirt, her earlier excitement replaced by a quiet apprehension. Mark, trying to keep his voice calm, smiled down at her. "Don't worry, Lil. Everything's all right," he said softly, though in the back of his mind he couldn't help but wonder what was going on. Across the park, Cho sat frozen on her bench, her iced tea forgotten. The weight of what she had done began to sink in. She had always prided herself on being a responsible member of the community, someone who looked out for others and stepped in when something seemed wrong. But now, as the police cars pulled up to the curb, doubt gnawed at her. Had she really seen something wrong, or had she misjudged the situation entirely? Cho's internal conflict was palpable. She had acted on impulse, driven by an unsettling feeling she couldn't quite explain. To her, it felt like the right thing to do at the time, a gut reaction to a scene that didn't fit her narrow expectations of what a family should look like. But now, as the police officers exited their vehicles and began walking towards Mark and Lily, Cho couldn't shake the gnawing sense that she had made a mistake. Mark, still unaware of the reason behind the sirens, stood up slowly, holding Lily close to his side. His eyes scanned the park, searching for answers. He noticed the police officers heading in his direction, their expressions neutral but focused. The confusion on his face deepened. What could have happened to warrant the presence of law enforcement in the middle of a peaceful afternoon at the park? Lily, ever perceptive, looked up at her father, her big blue eyes filled with questions. "Daddy, why are the police here?" she asked innocently, her voice tinged with curiosity. Mark didn't have an answer. "I don't know, sweetie," he replied, keeping his tone light for her sake. "But let's just stay calm, okay? There's nothing to worry about." As the officers approached, Mark instinctively stood a little straighter, his protective instincts kicking in. His heart began to beat a little faster, though he couldn't pinpoint why. It was as if the presence of the police brought with it an unspoken tension, one that weighed heavily on him even though he knew he had done nothing wrong. The first officer, a tall man with a stern expression, reached Mark and Lily. His partner, a woman with a more approachable demeanor, stood slightly behind him. The tall officer addressed Mark, his tone professional but cautious. "Excuse me, sir," the officer began. "We received a call about a potential incident involving a child. Can you tell us what's going on here?" Mark's confusion deepened. "An incident?" he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "There's no incident here. My daughter just fell while we were playing. She's fine." He gestured to Lily, who was now holding onto his leg, her eyes wide as she watched the exchange. The female officer knelt down to Lily's level, offering her a warm smile. "Hi there, sweetie. Are you all right?" she asked in a gentle tone, trying to put the little girl at ease. Lily, still unsure of what was happening, nodded slowly. "I'm okay," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just fell. My daddy helped me." The officers exchanged a glance, their initial tension easing slightly. It was clear that nothing alarming had taken place, but they still had a responsibility to investigate the call they had received. The female officer looked back at Mark, her expression softening. "We just want to make sure everything's all right," she explained. "Do you mind if we ask a few more questions?" Mark, who was still confused and a little unsettled, nodded. "Of course," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "But can you tell me why you're here in the first place? Who called you?" The male officer hesitated for a moment before answering. "We received a report from someone in the park who was concerned about the welfare of the child," he said carefully, not wanting to escalate the situation. Mark's eyes widened in shock. A report? Concerned about her welfare, he looked down at Lily, who was now clinging to his leg, clearly sensing the seriousness of the situation. His heart sank as he realized what must have happened. Someone had seen him, a black man, with his white daughter, and they had jumped to the worst possible conclusion. For a moment, Mark was at a loss for words. The absurdity of it all hit him like a wave, and yet he wasn't entirely surprised. This wasn't the first time people had made assumptions about him and Lily, though it was by far the most serious. He had dealt with the stares, the whispered comments, the confused looks from strangers who couldn't seem to wrap their heads around the idea that a black man could be the father of a white child. But this was different. This was an accusation, and it stung in a way that was hard to describe. Mark took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Officer," he began, his voice firm but calm, "this is my daughter. I adopted her when she was a baby. We were just playing in the park, and she fell. That's all that happened." The officers listened, and it was clear that they believed him. The female officer nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I'm sorry for the confusion," she said, standing up and addressing both Mark and Lily. "It seems like this was just a misunderstanding. We'll clear things up, and you won't have to worry about this any further." But the damage had already been done. Mark felt a mix of anger and sadness welling up inside him. He had done nothing wrong, and that here he was being questioned by the police in front of his daughter, all because someone couldn't see past the color of his skin. He glanced around the park, searching for the person who had made the call. His eyes landed on Cho, still sitting on the bench, watching the scene with a conflicted expression. In that moment, Mark realized that it was her. He didn't know Cho personally, but he had seen her around the neighborhood before. She had never said more than a polite hello in passing, but now he could see the truth behind her eyes. She had assumed the worst about him, not because of anything he had done, but because of who he was and who his daughter was. Cho, for her part, felt the weight of Mark's gaze and shifted uncomfortably. She had thought she was doing the right thing, acting out of concern for the little girl. But now, as she watched the officers speak with Mark, it became painfully clear that she had been wrong. There was no danger, no sinister plot, no reason for the police to be involved. All she had done was impose her own fears and prejudices on a situation she didn't fully understand. As the officers prepared to leave, offering Mark a final apology, Cho stood up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she got to say something to try and make amends for what she had done. But as she took a tentative step towards Mark, the words caught in her throat. Mark, holding Lily's hand, looked back at Cho one last time before turning away. He wasn't interested in hearing her apology, not now at least. What good were words in the face of such an ugly assumption? He had more important things to focus on, like making sure his daughter was all right and shielding her from the harsh realities of the world for as long as he could. As they walked away, Mark squeezed Lily's hand a little tighter. "Come on, Lil," he said softly. "Let's go get some ice cream. How does that sound?" Lily, still holding onto her father's hand, smiled up at him. "That sounds good, Daddy." And with that, they left the park behind them, the weight of the moment still heavy on Mark's shoulders, but his love for his daughter stronger than any of the assumptions that had been made about them. The consequences of misjudgment. As Mark and Lily walked away from the park, the echoes of sirens still seemed to reverberate in Mark's mind. He tried to push away the frustration, the anger, and the sadness that gnawed at him. But it wasn't easy. Every step he took away from the police and Cho felt heavy, as if the weight of a system that constantly misunderstood him was pressing down harder and harder. Lily, skipping beside him with her small hand in his, seemed blissfully unaware of the deeper tension that had played out moments ago. She was resilient, her attention already shifting back to their day together. "Daddy, can we get chocolate and vanilla ice cream? And maybe sprinkles, too?" she asked, her voice full of hope and innocence. Mark looked down at her, forcing a smile, wanting to preserve her happiness. She didn't need to know everything yet, not the darker parts of life that she would inevitably face as she grew older. He knew there would be questions in the future, questions about why people sometimes looked at them strangely, why they assumed things that weren't true, and why the world still hadn't caught up to the love they shared. But for now, she was 6 and her world was still relatively small and safe. "Of course, sweetheart," he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. "We can get all the sprinkles you want." But his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about how quickly Cho had judged him. It wasn't the first time he had felt the sting of someone's biased assumptions, but this time was different. The police had shown up. His father had been questioned, not by words but by action, by a call to authorities that could have escalated into something far worse. He had heard too many stories about how situations like this could spiral out of control, how innocent men had faced much harsher consequences simply because of a phone call from someone who misunderstood. As they neared the ice cream stand, Mark's thoughts drifted back to his early days with Lily. Adopting her had been the most significant decision of his life. He had always known he wanted to be a father, But the moment he laid eyes on Lily, something clicked. She had been just a baby then, with a tuft of blonde hair and the brightest blue eyes he had ever seen. From the second he held her in his arms, she had felt like his daughter. But raising a white child as a black father came with its own set of challenges. Early on, he had dealt with intrusive questions from strangers, some well-meaning but others not so much. "Is she yours?" they would ask, as if a black man holding a white baby was something strange or suspicious. Even in the adoption process, there had been comments that stung more than he had anticipated. "Are you sure you want to adopt outside of your race? It might be hard for her," one of the adoption agents had once said, as if the love he could offer Lily wasn't enough to outweigh the societal challenges they would face together. But for Mark, love had always been the core of their relationship. He had raised Lily with patience, warmth, and a fierce dedication to her happiness. He never wanted her to feel different or as though she didn't belong. He made sure she knew that families came in all shapes, sizes, and colors. To him, nothing mattered more than making sure she felt loved and protected. After they bought their ice cream, Mark and Lily sat on a bench near the park's edge, away from the area where the incident had happened. Lily eagerly dug into her cone, her face lighting up with each bite. Mark, watching her, felt a brief reprieve from his frustration. Her joy was contagious, and for a moment, he allowed himself to relax. "Daddy," Lily said suddenly, looking up from her ice cream. "Why did the police come? Did something bad happen?" Mark felt his heart tighten. He had hoped she wouldn't ask, but he knew she would. He'd always promised himself he wouldn't lie to her, but how could he explain what had just happened in a way that a 6-year-old could understand? He took a deep breath and smiled softly. "No, sweetie, nothing bad happened. Someone just got a little confused, that's all." Lily blinked, her face scrunching up in thought. Confused? About what? Mark hesitated. He didn't want to burden her with the harsh reality of the world just yet, but at the same time, he didn't want to avoid the truth. "Well, sometimes people don't understand things right away. They might see something and think it's different from what it really is. But that doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means they're not always thinking clearly." Lily nodded slowly, taking in his words as she licked her ice cream. "So they thought something was wrong, but it wasn't." "Exactly," Mark replied, relieved that she seemed satisfied with his explanation for now. "They thought something was wrong, but they didn't know the whole story." Lily smiled up at him, her trust in him absolute. "Well, I'm glad you're here, Daddy," she said, leaning into him. Mark wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I'm glad I'm here too, Lily." Across the park, Cho sat still on the bench where she had made the fateful call. The guilt that had been a flicker earlier was now a full-blown flame burning deep in her chest. She couldn't stop replaying the scene in her mind. The way Mark had looked at her, the shock and disappointment in his eyes. She had made a mistake. She knew that now. But it was a mistake that could have had much graver consequences. She thought about her own children, now grown, and how protective she had been when they were Lily's age. She had always believed that being vigilant was a good thing, that her quick thinking might prevent something terrible from happening. But now she wasn't so sure. In her attempt to protect, she had caused harm. She had called the police on a man who had done nothing wrong, on a father who was simply loving and caring for his daughter. She shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. Her mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. Why had she jumped to conclusions so quickly? Was it fear? Ignorance? She didn't want to think of herself as prejudiced, but there was no denying that her actions had been influenced by the fact that Mark was black and Lily was white. If the roles had been reversed, if Mark had been white and Lily black, would she have reacted the same way? The truth gnawed at her. Her phone buzzed in her lap, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from one of her neighbors, a part of their local neighborhood watch group. The message was mundane, a reminder about an upcoming meeting to discuss safety concerns in the area, but it brought everything into sharp focus. She had always thought of herself as a guardian of the community, someone who was looking out for the best interests of everyone. But in this case, her guardianship had led her down a path of misjudgment and harm. Cho couldn't shake the realization that her perception of safety had been colored by biases she didn't even know she had. Her decision to call the police had been more about her discomfort with the unfamiliar than about any real danger. And now, because of her, a father had been forced to defend his right to be with his daughter in the very community where he should have felt safe. She stood up, her legs feeling heavy beneath her, and looked around the park. Mark and Lily were still there, sitting by the ice cream stand. She could see them from a distance. Mark's arm protectively around his daughter, their bond undeniable even from far away. The scene was so innocent, so loving, that it made her heart ache. Jill wanted to apologize, but she didn't know how. What could she possibly say that would undo the harm she had caused? How could she explain herself when her actions had been so blatantly wrong? She took a few hesitant steps toward them, but then stopped. Apologizing wouldn't fix what she had done, and she wasn't sure if Mark would even want to hear it. In that moment, she realized that some things couldn't be undone with words. What she had to do now was learn from her mistake, confront her own biases, and try to do better. With a heavy heart, she turned and walked away from the park. As she left, the weight of her misjudgment still hung heavily on her, a reminder of the damage that could be done when assumptions replace understanding. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could change how she moved forward. And that, she hoped, would be enough to make a difference, if not for Mark and Lily, then at least for herself. Echoes of prejudice and reflection. The ride back home from Greenwood Park was unusually quiet. Lily sat in the backseat, contently humming to herself and nibbling on the last bit of her ice cream cone. The sight of her innocent joy soothed Mark's frayed nerves to a degree, but the silence felt oppressive. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface during the incident earlier still lingered, heavy and inescapable. As he drove, Mark found himself replaying the scene again and again, despite his best efforts to focus on the road ahead. The disbelief in Cho's eyes, the immediate assumption of wrongdoing, the wary stares from bystanders as the police had approached, all of it. It wasn't new to him, but it never got easier. He was used to the subtle but ever-present feeling of being watched. In stores, on the streets, even in places where he felt he should belong, like the park. People sometimes watched him too closely, like they were waiting for him to prove him right, to confirm their preconceived notions about him, a black man moving through a world that was often unkind. But today's incident had cut deeper, because this time it wasn't just about him. It was about his daughter. "Daddy, look, a rainbow." Lily's voice broke into his thoughts, bright and enthusiastic, as she pressed her face against the car window, pointing toward the horizon where a faint rainbow arched across the sky. The rain had come and gone while they had been in the park, leaving behind the rainbow as a quiet, colorful reminder of hope. Mark glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing her bright smile and the way her blonde curls bounced as she shifted in excitement. He forced a smile, but it felt thin. He didn't want to dampen her spirit, but the weight of what had happened still hung heavily over him. "That's beautiful, Lily. We'll see it better when we get home," Mark replied, his voice soft but tinged with an emotion he couldn't quite hide. Lily settled back into her seat, content for the moment, and Mark's thoughts turned inward again. He knew the conversations he would have to have with Lily as she got older. They had come close to it today, but he had managed to sidestep the more difficult truths. Eventually, she would ask harder questions about race, about why people sometimes looked at them strangely, about why she didn't always look like him, and why that seemed to bother others more than it did them. He wasn't naive. He knew that he couldn't shield her from these realities forever, but a part of him wished he could. The world outside their home wasn't always kind, and he dreaded the day Lily might feel the stain of prejudice aimed directly at her. Until now, she had been blissfully unaware of the complexities that their family presented to some people. In her eyes, love was love and family was family. Mark cherished that innocence, but he knew it was fragile. As they pulled into the driveway of their modest suburban home, Mark glanced up at the house, a symbol of stability and love, a place where they were free from judgment. Here, inside these walls, nothing mattered but the love they shared. It was their sanctuary, a refuge from the misunderstandings and biases that lurked outside. But even this sanctuary could not keep the world at bay forever. After parking the car, Mark opened the door for Lily, helping her out of her car seat. She giggled as he swung her down, her arms wrapped around his neck for a moment before she bounded toward the front door. "Come on, Daddy, race you inside," she called, her voice full of playful energy. It was as if nothing had happened at the park, as if the day had been filled only with ice cream and rainbows. Mark smiled, letting her run ahead as he walked more slowly. He watched her, his heart swelling with love and protectiveness. It was a strange, bittersweet feeling, the joy of seeing his daughter so happy, mixed with the fear that her world would not always be so simple. Inside the house, a familiar warmth embraced them. The living room was filled with toys scattered about, a small collection of Lily's artwork adorning the walls. Her latest drawing, an abstract splash of colors, had been taped up on the fridge earlier that week. It was a house, she had said, surrounded by sunshine and flowers. Mark had marveled at her ability to create something so cheerful and full of life. "Daddy, can I watch cartoons?" Lily asked, already kicking off her shoes and hopping onto the couch. "Sure, baby girl," Mark replied, grabbing the remote and handing it to her. He sat beside her for a moment, watching as she flicked through channels until she settled on a brightly colored show about talking animals. The sound of playful voices filled the room, but Mark's mind was elsewhere. He leaned back into the cushions, trying to relax, but the events of the day still gnawed at him. He thought about Cho. What had she seen when she looked at him? What assumptions had flashed through her mind in those first moments? Was it fear? Distrust? He couldn't say for sure, but he knew the outcome. Her snap judgment had led to police officers questioning him in front of his daughter. It could have been worse, much worse, and that thought chilled him. He didn't hate Cho. He didn't even know her. But her actions had stirred something in him, an anger, yes, but also a deep sadness. It was the sadness that lingered because it was a reminder that despite all the progress society claimed to have made, people still saw him through the lens of their own prejudices. It wasn't just about one woman's mistake. It was about a system of thinking that had been ingrained for generations. A system that painted men like him as dangerous, even when they were simply playing with their children in a park. Mark had always believed in leading by example. He prided himself on being patient, calm, and kind even when faced with ignorance or prejudice. But he also knew that there was only so much one person could do to change the way the world saw him. Later that evening, after Lily had fallen asleep, Mark sat at the kitchen table, his hands cradling a mug of tea. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The silence gave him space to think, but the thoughts weren't comforting. He wondered how many more moments like today would come in the future. He thought about the conversations he would eventually need to have with Lily, the ones that would break her heart a little but would also prepare her for the world outside their home. He thought about how he would explain to her that people sometimes make assumptions based on things they don't understand, and that those assumptions could hurt. But how could he explain it without making her feel like she didn't belong? Without making her feel like their family was somehow wrong? Those were the questions that haunted him because he didn't have easy answers. Mark sighed, leaning back in his chair. He wished the world could see what he saw when he looked at Lily, pure, unfiltered love. He wished that people like Cho could look beyond the surface and see the bond they shared, the way they fit together in a way that transcended race or biology. But he knew that wasn't how the world worked. The world saw categories, differences, things that didn't align with its expectations. The next day, Mark found himself at work, but his mind was elsewhere. He worked as an architect, designing buildings and spaces that brought people together. He loved his job, loved the creativity and problem-solving it demanded. But today, the designs on his desk seemed far less significant compared to the larger, more complicated questions swirling in his mind. By lunchtime, he had made up his mind. He couldn't just let the incident from yesterday go without addressing it. Ignoring it wouldn't change anything, and he didn't want to teach Lily to just accept the way things were. He wanted to be proactive, to find a way to channel his frustration into something constructive. He didn't know exactly what that would look like yet, but he knew one thing for sure. It had to start with a conversation, with educating people like Cho who acted out of fear and ignorance rather than malice. Mark knew it wouldn't be easy, but if he could help change even one person's perspective, it would be worth it. He wasn't going to let the world define his family. They would define it for themselves together. Confronting the unspoken. The next few days passed in a blur for Mark. He threw himself into work as if the routine of designing buildings and perfecting floor plans could erase the heaviness that lingered after the incident at Greenwood Park. But no matter how much he tried to immerse himself in blueprints and sketches, the memory of that day gnawed at him. The moment Cho had called the police, the questions from the officers, and a way Lily had looked up at him with confused, innocent eyes, they all remained lodged in his mind. By Friday evening, the unease had turned into something more. Mark felt a restless energy bubbling inside him. Avoiding the situation was no longer an option. He knew he had to address it, not just for himself but for Lily. He didn't want his daughter to grow up in a world where people made assumptions about her family without consequence. He wanted to create a space for dialogue, a chance to make something positive out of the negative experience. Mark decided to talk to someone who might understand. He had a friend, a fellow parent named Greg, who lived in the neighborhood. Greg was white like Lily and had adopted 2 children of different races with his husband. They had been close since their kids had started playing together at school, and Greg always had a way of offering perspective, especially on tough topics. If anyone could help Mark figure out what to do next, it was him. That Saturday morning, Mark dropped Lily off at a friend's house for a playdate and walked over to Greg's place. Greg's home was just a few blocks away, a cozy, welcoming space filled with warmth and love. Mark had always admired how effortlessly Greg and his family navigated the complexities of being a multiracial, non-traditional family in a world that wasn't always accepting. Greg answered the door with a smile, ushering Mark inside and immediately offering him coffee. His home smelled like fresh cinnamon rolls, and the sound of his kids laughing in the background filled the space with life. "I've been meaning to catch up with you, man. What's been going on?" "You look like you've got something on your mind," Greg said as he handed Mark a steaming mug and led him to the kitchen table. Mark took a deep breath, then launched into the story. He told Greg about the incident at Greenwood Park, about how Cho had misinterpreted the situation and called the police. He explained how the officers had approached him, and how he had been forced to prove that he was Lily's father in front of everyone. Greg listened quietly, his brow furrowed in concern, occasionally nodding but letting Mark speak uninterrupted. When Mark finished, there was a heavy silence between them, broken only by the faint sound of the kids playing in the background. "Man, that's rough," Greg said finally, his voice thoughtful. "I'm so sorry you've had to go through that. It's one of those things we always worry about, isn't it? People not understanding our families. But it still stings when it actually happens. Mark nodded, his hands tightening around the mug. Yeah, and the thing is, I wasn't surprised. I've dealt with stuff like this before, just never with Lily involved. It hit differently this time because, I don't know. I guess I just don't want her to ever feel like she doesn't belong with me. I get that, Greg said, leaning back in his chair. It's hard. Our kids will have to deal with things that other kids won't, and it's up to us to guide them through it, but doesn't make it any easier. Mark sighed, running a hand over his face. I just keep thinking, what do I do next? I don't want to ignore it. I don't want to teach Lily that we just let things like this slide, but I also don't know how to address it in a way that doesn't make it worse. Greg was quiet for a moment, then he spoke, choosing his words carefully. You know, and I think you're right not to let it go. But maybe it doesn't have to be a confrontation. Maybe it's about education. People like Cho, they act out of ignorance more than malice. I've dealt with it too. People see our family and don't know what to make of it. They make assumptions because they don't understand. It sucks, but sometimes they just need a wake-up call, something to make them see things differently. Mark mulled over Greg's words. He had been so angry at Cho, so frustrated by her snap judgment, but maybe Greg was right. Maybe this was less about punishment and more about creating a moment for understanding. He had always believed that most people were capable of growth if given the chance. Perhaps this was his opportunity to help Cho see beyond her biases. I've been thinking about talking to her, Mark admitted. I don't know her well, but I see her around the neighborhood sometimes. Maybe I could approach her and just, I don't know, have a conversation. Greg raised an eyebrow, impressed. That takes guts, man. But I think it could be powerful. If she's willing to listen, it might change her perspective. And who knows? It could prevent something like this from happening again to you or anyone else. Mark nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the decision. It was risky. He didn't know how Cho would react, whether she'd be defensive or open to the conversation. But staying silent felt worse. He didn't want this to become just another example of racial bias left unaddressed, another moment of hurt swept under the rug. As the day went on, Mark wrestled with his decision. That evening, after putting Lily to bed, he sat in the quiet of his living room, thinking about what he would say. He wasn't looking for an apology, though it would be nice. But more than anything, he wanted to create a dialogue. He wanted to challenge the assumptions that led to incidents like this, the unspoken prejudices that caused someone like Cho to see him as a threat instead of a father. The following week, Mark found the opportunity he had been waiting for. He saw Cho in the grocery store, standing in the produce section, carefully selecting apples. His heart raced as he approached, unsure of how this would go. But he reminded himself of why he was doing this. Not just for himself, but for Lily and for the many others who experience these moments of misunderstanding and bias. Cho, Mark called out gently, stepping closer. She turned, her face lighting up in recognition, though there was a flicker of discomfort when she realized who it was. Oh, Mark. Hi. For a moment, there was an awkward silence. Cho seemed to sense that this wasn't just a casual greeting, and her hands fidgeted nervously with the apples in her basket. I've been meaning to talk to you, Mark said, his voice steady but firm, about what happened at the park. Cho's face paled slightly, and she looked down, clearly uneasy. Yes, I've been thinking about that too. Mark appreciated her honesty, though he could see the discomfort in her posture. He took a deep breath. I just want to understand. What did you see that day? What made you think something was wrong? Cho hesitated, glancing around as if looking for an escape, but she didn't leave. Instead, she sighed and spoke softly. I don't know, Mark. I saw Lily fall and you were there and my mind went to the worst place. I know it sounds terrible, but I wasn't thinking straight. I didn't know she was your daughter. Mark nodded, understanding, but also saddened by her admission. But that's the thing, Cho. You assumed something was wrong because I'm black and she's not. That's what I wanted to talk about. Cho winced at the bluntness, but Mark continued before she could respond. I'm not angry, but I need you to understand what that felt like. You didn't see a father taking care of his daughter. You saw something else because of the color of my skin. And that's not just about me, it's about how society teaches us to see people. I've dealt with this before, but now it's affecting Lily, and that's not something I can ignore. Cho's eyes welled up with emotion, and she nodded slowly. I didn't mean to make you feel like that. I'm sorry, Mark. I really am. Mark appreciated her apology, but he also knew that words alone wouldn't change the deeper issue. I believe you. But it's not just about this one time. It's about recognizing those assumptions we carry with us and challenging them. I'm asking you to think about that not just with me, but with anyone you come across who doesn't fit your expectations. Cho looked down at her hands, clearly affected by what Mark had said. I will. I promise. I didn't realize how deep those thoughts were in me. I feel awful. Mark softened, realizing that this conversation had already begun to make a difference. It's not about making you feel bad. It's about doing better, all of us. And I appreciate you listening. I hope the next time you see something like this, you'll see it differently. Cho nodded again, her expression a mix of regret and determination. I will, Mark. I'm really sorry. They stood there for a moment longer, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. It wasn't perfect and it wouldn't erase what had happened, but it was a start. And sometimes that was enough. Mark left the grocery store building bridges, changing minds. Mark left the grocery store feeling a mix of emotions, relief, exhaustion, and cautious optimism. The conversation with Cho hadn't been easy, but it felt necessary. He knew that changing deeply ingrained prejudices didn't happen in a single conversation, but he hoped that he had planted a seed of understanding. Still, the weight of that day in Greenwood Park lingered, not just in his mind, but in his heart. For him, it was never just about the incident, it was about the world he wanted to build for Lily. As he walked home, Mark found himself thinking not only about the future, but about the past. He had always known that being a black father to a white child would invite stares and questions. From the moment he and his late wife had decided to adopt Lily, they had prepared themselves for the challenges. They had talked at length about how they would raise Lily to be proud of her identity, how they would handle the questions that would inevitably arise. But no amount of preparation could shield them from the realities of a world still grappling with racial divisions and assumptions. Lily had been so young when his wife passed away. Sometimes Mark still marveled at how resilient his daughter was, how she had faced the world with a heart wide open despite the challenges they had faced as a family. But that day in the park had reminded him that the world wouldn't always be so kind or accepting of their family dynamic. And it was his job to prepare her for that, to teach her that love, not blood, made a family, and that their bond was stronger than anyone's prejudices. As he approached his home, the soft glow of the evening sun bathed the house in a warm light. It felt like a reminder that despite everything, there was still beauty and hope in the world. When Mark opened the door, he was greeted by the sound of Lily's laughter echoing from the living room. She was playing with her toys, her unruly blonde curls bouncing as she made up an elaborate story involving knights, princesses, and dragons. Her imagination was boundless, and in that moment, she was completely unaware of the complexities and challenges that surrounded her. Mark stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, feeling a deep sense of love and responsibility wash over him. This was why he had confronted Cho, why he would continue to fight for a world where his daughter wouldn't be judged by the color of her skin or by the fact that her father's didn't match hers. He walked over to her, kneeling down to join in her game. "Daddy." Lily beamed, rushing over to him with her favorite toy dragon in hand. "Look, the dragon's flying over the castle, and the princess is about to save the night." Mark chuckled, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "The princess is saving the night? Isn't it supposed to be the other way around?" Lily's eyes sparkled with defiance, her small hands on her hips. "No way. The princess is brave and strong, just like you always say. She can save anyone she wants." Mark smiled, feeling a swell of pride. He loved that Lily was growing up with the belief that she could be strong, courageous, and capable. He wanted her to know that the world was hers to shape, not the other way around. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her into a hug. "You're absolutely right, sweetheart," he said, kissing the top of her head. "The princess can do anything she sets her mind to." That night, after tucking Lily into bed and reading her a story, Mark sat down at his computer. His mind had been racing with ideas ever since the conversation with Cho, and he knew he needed to do something more. He didn't want what had happened in the park to be just another personal experience. He wanted it to lead to something bigger, something that could help other families like his. Mark began researching organizations that supported interracial families, adoption advocacy groups, and community programs that promoted dialogue around race and family diversity. The more he looked, the more he realized how much work still needed to be done. While there were resources available, they often lacked a local presence, and that was something he wanted to change. By the time the clock struck midnight, Mark had already begun drafting an email to the neighborhood association. He proposed organizing a community event, a family picnic in Greenwood Park, the very place where the incident had occurred. But this time, it would be different. He envisioned a gathering where families of all types could come together, share their stories, and learn from one another. There would be games for the kids, food from local vendors, and a discussion panel led by adoption specialists, social workers, and parents like him, people who understood the complexities of building non-traditional families in a world that wasn't always welcoming. The goal, Mark wrote, was to create a space for education, empathy, and connection. It wouldn't just be a chance to confront prejudices. It would be an opportunity to build bridges across differences, to show the community that love and family came in all shapes, sizes, and colors. He knew it was ambitious, but after what had happened, he felt a responsibility to act. He sent the email off, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. It wasn't easy putting himself out there, especially in a neighborhood where many people still harbored outdated views. But he reminded himself that change didn't come from staying silent. It came from speaking up, from taking action, and from creating spaces where difficult conversations could take place. Over the next few weeks, Mark's plan began to take shape. The neighborhood association was surprisingly receptive to the idea, and several local organizations offered their support. Word spread quickly, and soon families from all over the area were signing up to attend. Mark received messages from parents of interracial families, single parents, same-sex couples, and others who shared their excitement about the event. It was clear that there was a need for this type of gathering, a need for community and understanding. When the day of the picnic finally arrived, Greenwood Park was transformed. Colorful banners and balloons decorated the space, and the sound of children laughing and playing filled the air. The smell of freshly grilled burgers and hot dogs wafted from the food trucks, and families gathered at picnic tables, chatting and enjoying the warm summer day. Mark stood near the entrance, greeting people as they arrived. He felt a sense of pride and fulfillment as he watched the park fill with families of all kinds. Lily ran ahead, eager to join her friends on the playground. Mark smiled, knowing that this event was for her as much as it was for anyone else. As the day unfolded, the conversation panel proved to be the highlight of the event. Parents shared their experiences, both the joys and the challenges of raising children in non-traditional families. Social workers spoke about the importance of fostering inclusive communities, and adoption specialists provided resources for families looking to navigate the complex emotions that often accompanied interracial adoptions. At one point, Mark noticed Chu standing near the edge of the crowd, watching the panel with a thoughtful expression. He hadn't expected her to come, but there she was, listening intently. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave him a small, hesitant wave. Mark nodded in return, appreciating her presence. It was a small step, but it meant something. It meant that she was willing to learn, to change. Later in the day, as the sun began to set and the event wound down, Mark found himself standing by the playground, watching Lily play with a group of kids. She was running around laughing, her blonde curls bouncing in the breeze. It was the same scene as that day in the park, but this time it felt different. There were no assumptions, no police, no whispers of suspicion. Just her father and his daughter, surrounded by a community that was learning to see the world through a wider, more compassionate lens. As the evening drew to a close, Greg walked over and clapped Mark on the back. "You did it, man. This is amazing." Mark smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. "We did it. This is what community is about." Greg nodded, looking out at the families still lingering in the park. "You're right, and this is just the beginning." Mark knew Greg was right. The picnic wasn't the end of the story, it was the start of something bigger. A new chapter, not just for his family, but for the entire community. A chapter where people like Cho and even strangers in the park could learn to see beyond our assumptions, to recognize the beauty in diversity, and to understand that family was about love, not appearances. As Mark watched Lily climb up the slide, her laughter echoing through the park, he felt a deep sense of hope for the future. They still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a while, he believed that they were headed in the right direction. And that was all that mattered. In that moment, Mark realized that while they couldn't change the past, they could shape the future. And for Lily, for all the children like her, they would.